Hi guys, welcome to another session of News in 30 minutes. Today, before we get on with the important issues of the day, I just want to remind everyone that roadmap for prelims 2024 is live. I've released this video. This video is a part 1 series. It talks about what a student has to do from the month of December till the month of February. So I have given the blueprint of how a student has to go about their UPSC prelims preparation if they are attempting 2024. So please make good use of it. I have given you the broader frameworks. You can make certain minor modifications, but one sincere request for each and everyone is start your prelims preparation. Please let go of that ego thinking that you still have to prepare for mains. Please start off your prelims preparation. Okay, with that, let us start off with some of the important issues on 8th of December 2023. Okay, the first is regarding acid attacks. Acid attacks remain a blot that needs government and societal action. Acid attacks can be termed the most dastardly crime carried out viciously on an unsuspecting victim. Almost always, the perpetrator is male and the victim is female, and the motive is revenge. Okay. Unfortunately, these acid attacks are still taking place very openly in the Indian subcontinent, not only in India but also in other South Asian nations as well. Okay. Now, the reason why this is in news is recently NCRB, that is the National Crime Record Bureau, released a report, 2023 report. In this, one of the violent activities that is still practiced is acid attacks. Okay, and in this acid attacks, the NCRB report says that there are around 200 acid attack cases that are registered every year. Around 200 acid attack cases that are registered every year. And as the NCRB report itself suggests that almost always the perpetrator is male and the victim is female. Unfortunately, this is how it is. Okay. And the reasons given by the NCRB report is, the reasons for the acid attacks is: 1. Rejection of advances. When the male tries to advance towards the female and when the female rejects, that is one of the most important reason. The next is property disputes. The third is dowry harassment. The fourth is domestic abuse. In all these cases, what is the common underlining theme is teaching her a lesson. So this is the underlining theme which will result in that male perpetrator who will commit that acid attack. Okay. Now, the reason why I am telling you all this is this will help you analyze the social reasons of why acid attacks are still so operated in this Indian soil. Okay. There are so many social factors that are involved here which needs to be corrected if we have to overcome this problem of acid attack. Okay. Now, before I get into the what needs to be done, one thing what you should know is, coming from the legislative framework, okay, or the laws of the land. If I have to talk about the laws of the land, one, in 2013, the Supreme Court had told, or it had banned the over-the-counter sale of acid. It had banned the over-the-counter sale of acid, and it also instructed the officials to issue licenses. It also instructed the officials to issue licenses to those suppliers of acids. Okay, those who supply acid, they have to get licenses. It had also told or instructed the officials that registration ID, that is ID card, is important, as well as address is important if someone has to buy the acid. Okay, so this was what was the framework that was given by the Supreme Court. Again, this is an example of what can be used in judicial activism. This is an example of judicial activism. Because there was a vacuum in the legislation regarding acid attack, the judiciary had to step in to create a framework to stop such incidences of acid attack. Okay. However, this is what the Supreme Court had given the judgment in 2013. And also, one more thing is post Nirbhaya case. Okay. Because of the Justice Verma committee report. Okay. There were changes done in IPC, in CRPC and Indian Evidence Act. Okay, IPC, CRPC and Indian Evidence Act. So, when the changes were made in these three, the acid attacks was made a separate offence. It was made a separate offence, and accordingly, once it was made a separate offence, the minimum punishment was given as 10 years and the maximum punishment is given as life imprisonment. Okay, so these additions were made within the legislations or the laws of the land regarding acid attacks. Okay, so though the Supreme Court has created this framework, and though we have the law of the land that is having such stringent punishment, why isn't it not possible to create a deterrence effect in preventing acid attacks? This is what you have to analyze. This is what you have to think. As I told you, think, analyze. When I tell you to analyze, you have to analyze from different perspective. Okay, from the perspective of the system, within the society. Okay, from the perspective of the male egoism. Okay, from the perspective of values that are ingrained in the society. Okay, and as I told you, all this points towards the social factors. Okay, and the next is obviously the legislative framework. When I say legislative framework, the reason is, though we have the law, the conviction rate is very low. Okay, the conviction rate is very low, and more or less the burden is shared by the attack or the victims. The victims have to share most of the burden. Okay, in this way, acid attacks are still rampantly seen in Indian society. Okay, as I told you, this is not something that is pertinent only to India, but this is something that is pertinent into the entire South Asia. Okay, the reason is because this is happening more because of the social factor, and the common and the underlying theme that we have to get rid of is teaching her a lesson. Unless we don't create a attitudinal shift where we are nobody to teach and her is also having their own rights, we will not overcome this problem of acid attack. Okay, so this teaching should go, and this her that is purely coming from this patriarchal system has to be gone if we have to overcome the problems of acid attacks. So I hope you understood how to analyze and think regarding this acid attacks. Only having the legislative framework will not do. We have to address it from the problem of social systems. It is one of the social evils. Okay, it is one of the social evils of Indian society that still exists, and we have to fight this evil vehemently. With that, this issue is done. Let us go to the next issue of the day. The next issue is EU's decision to impose carbon tax not at all moral, says the finance minister. She said that every country will have to have resources generated to meet with demands so that we are better adjusted to the green commitments we have made globally. Okay, so what our finance minister is talking about is EU has come up with something called carbon border adjustment mechanism. Okay, EU has released a program or an initiative called carbon border adjustment mechanism. Okay, basically this is acting like a carbon tax. This is disguised as carbon tax for all the goods that are imported. Okay, it is a disguised carbon tax for all the goods that are imported. This is a layman way of telling what this means. Now, to tell it in a more flashy way, or to tell it in a more literary language, they say that it is a price that is to be paid. It is a price to be paid for the embedded carbon emissions. Price to be paid for the embedded carbon emissions generated in the production of certain goods. Okay, so when I say embedded carbon emissions, let me give you a price. If let us say if I take iron ore as well as aluminium. In the production of iron ore and aluminium, there is enormous amount of carbon dioxide that is emitted. Okay, there is enormous amount of carbon dioxide that is emitted. So because more carbon dioxide is emitted, these materials, when they are getting imported into European Union, they have to pay a high carbon tax. Okay, so if you take any goods, depending upon how much of emissions as it committed during its production process, that is what is known as embedded carbon emissions. Okay, embedded carbon emissions. Okay, so basically any goods, how much of emission is done during the production process, that is what is embedded carbon emission. So the more the emission is there, the more will be the carbon tax. So I hope you understood this. Okay, so this carbon border adjustment mechanism is a price or a tax. They say the price, but we will say it's a tax that is paid by any goods that is being imported into European Union and those that have high embedded carbon emissions. Okay, and this is supposed to start from the 1st of January 2026. Okay, and they are imposing this. Okay, they are imposing this CBAM to most of the imports. Like, see, they are imposing this to the imports. Like, one is iron and steel. Okay, the second is cement. The next is aluminium, fertilizer, electricity, hydrogen. Okay, obviously this will be a gray hydrogen. Okay, so look at this. Okay, they are imposing it on these imports because they have high embedded carbon emissions. Okay, now this is what it looks from the outside. It looks like it is a very novel initiative, but the unfairness of this is most of this comes from developing countries. Okay, most of these imports come from developing countries like India. Okay, and these developing countries are mainly dependent on the coal for electricity or power. So if their industries have to run, they use coal. So because they use coal, obviously the carbon emissions on any of these products will be very, very high. And because the carbon emissions will be high, all these countries will end up paying high carbon tax. So it is in a way introducing the carbon border adjustment mechanism is in a disguised manner collecting more carbon tax from developing countries, especially India. Also, one, you are collecting more tax from the developing countries. The second is because you are collecting more tax from developing countries, the imports from developed nations will start seeming to have less price. And because they have less price, because they carry less carbon tax, they have less price, they become more attractive. So in a way, one, you are reducing the price of the developed nations goods, and you are creating more market for the developed nations goods within the European Union. Okay, so it is actually creating two things at once. Okay, so to summarize, CBAM is in one way increasing the price. It is increasing the price of goods that are imported from developing nations. Okay, and the second is it is making the goods from developed nations. It is making goods from developed nations become more attractive. Why will the goods from developed nation becomes more attractive? Because they are not dependent more on coal in their production process. Because they are not dependent on coal in their production process, the embedded carbon emissions during the production process of these goods will be low. And because they will be low, they will attract low carbon tax, and hence their goods will become more lucrative in the market. Okay, so this is a disguised way. Okay, CBM is a disguised way to disregard the imports that are coming from developing nations and to create a market for developed nations. Okay, so basically this is completely negating climate justice. It is completely going back on the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. Forget differentiated responsibilities, it is something called diffusion of responsibilities. Instead of developed nations taking the responsibilities to fight climate change, they are putting more and more burden on the developing nations. Now what is this doing is, this will force the developing nations to reduce or phase out coal and to try to use renewable energy in the production process, which again results in increasing the cost of production and therefore the price of goods. So in a way, one thing what is sure is this scheme will reduce the market for developing countries. That is for sure. Though at the outset the scheme seems to be very novel, it seems to be fighting climate change, it is negating climate justice and it is going back on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Okay, so this is regarding CBAM. That is why our finance minister has termed it completely immoral, and which is rightly so. CBAM is completely immoral. It is not in tune with what we call as climate justice, and it does a disgrace on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Okay, so this is what is CBAM. Okay, let us go to the next issue of the day. The next issue is Cyclone Mishuang. The center announces 1,500 crore aid to Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh after cyclone wreaks havoc. So regarding tropical cyclones, you understood what are the concepts of tropical cyclones when in one of the sessions I have done what exactly is a cyclone and how there are two types of cyclones called tropical cyclones and temperate cyclones, and you have understood the mechanism of formation of tropical cyclones. Okay, now this is mainly regarding disaster management. Okay, so here the central government has announced a relief fund. Okay, it is announced a relief fund. Okay, so if, as you can see, 561 crore approved for urban flood management activities for Chennai city, Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh to get 450 crores. Okay, so basically what they are talking about is you have something called Disaster Management Act 2005, and according to Disaster Management Act 2005, it creates a three-tier system. And this three-tier system at the top is NDMA, that is the National Disaster Management Authority. Then you have SDMA, that is the State Disaster Management Authority. And then you have DDMA, that is the District Disaster Management Authority. So these are the three tiers. Along with this, the Disaster Management Act also creates something called National Disaster Mitigation Fund. Okay, mitigation fund. Now the central government can through this fund provide such relief. Okay, and the relief that the central government currently is providing to Chennai or Tamil Nadu, or it is providing to Andhra Pradesh, is from this National Disaster Mitigation Fund. So I hope you understood this. So the National Disaster Mitigation Fund is getting its powers from the Disaster Management Act 2005. Under this National Disaster Mitigation Fund, they have created one small component called Urban Flood Mitigation Project. Urban Flood Mitigation Project. So under this, they are giving around 500 crores to Tamil Nadu as well as Andhra Pradesh regarding the cyclones that has wreaked havoc in Chennai and other cities. Okay, so this is what is the news. Okay, so here the Disaster Management Act 2005, the National Disaster Mitigation Fund, and this three-tier becomes important. One more thing is, because they have used this keyword called urban floods, you should know what are urban floods. Okay, so if I take normal floods, the definition of normal floods is when the water from the river channel when the water from the river channel overflows, okay, when the water from the river channel overflows, resulting in inundating the adjacent floodplains. Okay, so if I take this as, if I take this as the river channel, okay, this is the, let us say that this is the river channel. Okay, so if that is the case, then the water, when it overflows from the river channel, now this part, okay, this part is known as floodplains, and this action, what is happening, is known as floods. Okay, so this is normal floods. Okay, now if I take urban floods, the difference between normal floods and urban floods is urban floods happen in developed catchments. It happens in developed catchments. When I say developed catchments, it means areas that are dominated by concretization. Areas that are dominated by concretization are known as developed catchments. And urban floods usually have flood peaks. They usually have flood peaks that are 1.8 to 8 times higher than normal flood, and they have flood volumes. They have flood volumes that are at least 6 times greater than normal flood. Okay, so what does this mean? This means if I draw a graph, okay, if I draw a graph and if I say this is flood duration, this is flood duration, and if I say this is flood volume, then if I take this as normal flood, okay, so this is the flood peak of normal flood and this is the flood volume of normal flood. Okay, so you have flood peak and flood volume. Now if I take urban floods, see urban floods, see this is the flood peak of urban flood and this is the flood volume of urban flood. So what they say is urban flood, if you look at this, the flood volume will almost be 6x times greater in respect to urban floods, and the flood peaks will always be around 1.8 to 8 times greater than normal flood. This is the difference between the urban floods compared to normal floods. So I hope you understood the difference. So what it means is urban floods are more catastrophic and it can create more damage. That is the end point of urban floods. Okay, one more thing is the population density. The population density in urban areas will be very high. Also, the infrastructure density will be very high. This, along with the solid waste disposal, is completely inorganized. So all this creates much more complexity whenever there is urban floods. And also, if you take the demography of urban floods, okay, the demography that will suffer in urban floods will be senior population. Because there are very high number of senior elder population in urban areas, they are the ones who will suffer when it comes to urban floods. So these are some of the problems regarding urban floods. Okay, now if they ask you the reasons, the increasing reasons for urban floods in India, obviously one of the most important reason is climate change and its effect, because of the increasing frequency of cyclones, okay, monsoon irregularities, okay, and because of events like cloud burst, all these are creating more effects of urban floods. But overall, the reasons are more anthropogenic. The reasons are more anthropogenic. So one and most important reason is the storm water drainage. Okay, storm water drainage is basically a drainage that is dedicated for the removal of rainwater. Okay, now in India, the average capacity of the storm water drainage is somewhere around 20 mm. But if I take Mumbai, in the month of July, the average capacity or the average rainfall that Mumbai receives will be somewhere near 868 mm. Look at this difference. Look at the average capacity of the stormwater drainage and look at the rainfall that is received in the region. Obviously, there is a dichotomy, so hence it will result in floods. The second reason is encroachments. Encroachments has happened in the floodplains, and this results in huge floods. The third reason is obviously, as I told you, developed catchments. As I told you, developed catchments means concretization. Because there is concretization, the water will not seep. It will not seep, it will not percolate. when the water is not percolated, then obviously the absorption capacity of the land is reduced, and this water then flows as the floods. And the last is dumping of waste in the river channels. Okay, where the river has to flow, you're dumping a lot of waste. If this is the river channel, if you're dumping a lot of waste in the river channel, you're reducing the carrying capacity of the river channel, and obviously whatever water that flows in this river channel, okay, whenever there is rainfall, there is water that flows in this river channel, and this water starts flooding. Okay, why it is flooding? Because you're adding waste in this river channel. Okay, so these are the broader reasons why you are seeing urban floods in India. Okay, so this is regarding this issue. And the last is a very, very good analysis of what is happening in South Asia. Okay, the author mainly talks about India's growing neighborhood dilemmas. Most South Asian states are skeptical of India's primacy in their own ways. Okay, it's a very, very good analysis that you can use to analyze, because in your GS2 paper, one question will always be asked on neighboring countries. Okay, one question will always be asked on neighboring countries, that is India's neighboring countries. So you can always use this to analyze your answers in your GS2 paper of international relation. Okay, so the author talks about the following dilemmas. What are the dilemmas that India faces? Broadly, the author talks about three dilemmas. The first dilemma the author tells is the rise of anti-India political regimes. The rise of anti-India political regimes. The example the author gives is Maldives. That's why the Maldives Prime Minister is vehemently telling India to take back all its military bases in Maldives. And this is a depiction of the rise of anti-Indian political regimes. The next, the author tells structural changes. The author talks about structural changes. What are the structural changes? The structural changes are Beijing's growing influence. Beijing is constantly growing in its influence in South Asia. The example that the author gives is one, he says more and more small states of South Asia are going into the ambit of One Belt One Road initiative. And the second is the Beijing has been very proactive in lending hand. The Beijing is very, very proactive in lending hand to the states of South Asia. He gives the example of Taliban led Afghanistan. Even here, Beijing was very first to act on this. The next is military ruled Myanmar. Even here, it was the Beijing that was first to act in extending the diplomatic hand. The third is crisis hit Sri Lanka. Okay, so in all the three scenarios, it was Beijing that came first with its hand for diplomatic, dialogues. So all this shows that Beijing is growing in its influence in South Asia, which shows that there are structural changes happening. This is the second dilemma. Okay, the third dilemma that the author tells is India's border disputes. India's border disputes with almost all of its neighboring countries. So when it has bordering disputes with all of its neighboring countries, its actions diplomatically becomes a little difficult. Okay, the maneuverability of diplomacy with balancing its border disputes becomes very, very complex scenario. Okay, so these are the three dilemmas that India faces in South Asia. Okay, so very beautifully written. You can use this analysis in your answers, in your introductions, anything. If they ask you regarding South Asia or neighboring countries, you can definitely use this analysis, a very nicely written analysis. Okay, the next is the author also says there are certain changes that are happening in South Asia. Okay, he says that there are certain changes happening in South Asia. One, he says geopolitical constant is changing. Okay, so this keyword, what do you mean by geopolitical constant? The author says that geopolitical constant was USA in South Asia. All these reasons. Now, because of the withdrawal of USA, because USA is no more interested in South Asia or West Asia, now there is a vacuum created, and this vacuum is now being filled by China. So this geopolitical constant is changing. The second is geopolitical buffer. The next is geopolitical buffer. Okay, now the countries of South Asia, you can take it as China. So the countries of South Asia, you can take it as Sri Lanka, you can take it as Nepal, you can take it as Bangladesh. So all these countries, what they are doing is they are using China as, they are playing the China card. That is, in order to get more bargaining power, they are using China as the geopolitical buffer. Okay, by using China as the geopolitical buffer, they can get their foreign policy assertions. They can get their foreign policy assertions with India. Okay, so this is the second change that is happening in South Asia. Okay, the third change that is happening in South Asia is the old South Asia where India enjoyed primacy is reducing. Okay, India enjoyed primacy is reducing. Okay, the countries in South Asia, they are tilting towards those power who can give them material needs. Okay, so the tilt of the South Asia, before it was giving primacy to India, and before the primacy was given to India basically on cultural and soft power. Because of the cultural and soft power, we were given the primacy in the South Asia. But recently now the countries are tilting towards those powers who can give them material needs. Okay, so this again is reducing India's influence in its neighboring states. Okay, so these are the broad changes. One, geopolitical constant is changing. The use of China as geopolitical buffer is increasing, and India, which was given primacy in the old South Asia because of cultural context as well as soft skills, is now moved or tilting towards those countries that can provide material needs to the countries of South Asia. So overall, the author will try to conclude by telling this. One, South Asia is replaced by something called Southern Asia. Now the reason is, in South Asia there was no China, whereas in Southern Asia there is China. Okay, so we have to also come back to this reality and work that China is also part of now Southern Asia. It is not going to back down. It is going to interfere in the internal affairs, and it is there to be present in the South Asian continent. Okay, the next, the author says that the art of diplomacy must change. India has always been a status quoist. India must not go ahead with this status quo attitude. It must learn to take sides. The second is, India should try to eliminate the anti-Indian sentiments. Now India is basically seen as big brother, and India must try to remove this big brother attitude and must try to improve its aid diplomacy, which India is already doing actually. The next is, India must come up with something called Gujarat Doctrine 2.0. Remember, Gujarat Doctrine is the one that talked about the neighborhood first policy. The neighborhood first policy. So we have to come up with another set of packages that will help win over our neighboring countries. Okay, so this is basically the view of the author written in the article. But with respect to the works done by India regarding the neighboring countries, if you take disaster management, India has always been in the forefront to help the neighboring nations. Example is Nepal earthquake. If you take the epidemics, the COVID epidemics, India was the first nation to supply vaccines to these nations. If you take power supply, we are supplying power mostly to Bangladesh, Nepal and Bhutan. Okay, if you also take aid diplomacy, okay, if you take Nepal, Bhutan and Sri Lanka, we have been the largest providers of benefits. Okay, so if you ask, India is already in that realm of Gujarat Doctrine 2.0. However, India has to continue doing this, but only thing what I feel that India has to do is India has to assume that China is now part of the South Asia. That is what this perspective that the author has given is very true. We need to now see South Asia from a larger context of Southern Asia, in which China is going to play a proactive role in the future as well. So with that assumption, we will be more cautious and will be more effective in our foreign policy. Hence, it gives a very good perspective and analysis regarding our strategy in South Asia. Okay, so these were some of the important issues of the day. I hope it was helpful. Again, to remind you, the roadmap for prelims 2024 is released. Make good use of it. Please follow the guidelines that I tell you, and please respect the prelims exam, respect your CSAT paper and give it its due time. Okay, and the TNT series will continue till the end of December. After the December, we will stop the TNT series because mostly you people will be more focused towards prelims. We will come to that TNT series again post prelims, but till December you can keep looking at the TNT series and making notes out of it. Okay, with that I would like to end the session. If you like the session, please like, share and subscribe. Thank you for all the love and support, guys. I know that you have always been supporting me. I will see you tomorrow. Thank you so much. Bye, guys.